Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. So we'll start today's session with a talk by our guest speaker, and it is our great honor to have Professor Christopher Lucas as our guest speaker today. Professor Lucas is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty affiliate with the Division of Computational and Data Sciences at Washington University and St. Louis. And he's a political methodologist who has published in top political science journals. And he has received the Gosnell Prize for Excellence in Political Methodology twice. And his ongoing works are supported by the National Science Foundation, and then he works extensively on developing and applying computational models for statistical analysis of speech audio. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lucas to give his talk. Professor Lucas, please.
Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen. You can all see that, I hope?
Yes.
Great. Oh, I should make this. Well, that's probably anyway. It's funny. I spent most of the pandemic making students who were in Asia, listen to me lecture in the middle of the night, and so this is the first time that I've done the kind of the same thing on my end, where it's 8:30 in the evening here and morning there. So it's great to join you, and I'm excited to talk about this paper. So this paper is a part of a broader research agenda, which sort of in general is thinking about both kind of approaches to measurement with audio data, and also with, I'm never actually, anyway, I'm gonna ignore this. Okay, so which thinks about, there we go, okay. I only use Chrome when I'm giving this presentation, and so it's the only time I'm ever in that browser. So this research kind of angle thinks generally about models and measurement with audio data. And so a lot of this paper is sort of going to build on a relatively recent publication at the APSR, also with Dean Knox, who's a collaborator and co-author on this paper. Dean is at Penn. And this paper is also with Taylor Damon, who's a talented and promising graduate student at WashU. And sort of related to this, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, we've been working pretty extensively on some software that will make it easy to do analyses like this. So we've already written a bunch of code. We got a bunch of C++ that does the sort of feature engineering very quickly and efficiently, which is wrapped in R, so you don't have to actually touch the C++. And we're also baking in a bunch of models, including the one that we've done in the APSR. So that's sort of the broader backdrop of where this paper sits. Now, in this paper in particular, I'm going to focus on the following, which is I'm going to, I guess this morning for you, evening for me, try to convince you that the study of political campaigns, of political campaigning in American politics, is missing an enormously important component of communication, which is strictly sort of the way that a speaker is going to talk, not just strictly the words they're going to use, but their rhetorical style, their ability as an orator. And so every other study of political campaigns thus far, that I'm aware of at least, in the history of at least American politics, has focused on the text of speech. So I'm going to convince you that by focusing on the text of speech, and by implication, ignoring non-textual features, we miss a lot of what makes successful political candidates win. And so importantly, and I think this is a key thing that I think about a lot, this isn't an omission that we're making by virtue of some theoretical position. We're not claiming that the text is all that matters. We're doing this because it's kind of empirically tractable. We're ignoring these other components of speech, these other components of campaigning, these other components of rhetorical style, because it's inconvenient to analyze them. And so if in fact we're ignoring this due to methodological limitations, I like to, in those cases, try to think of a way that we could remove that limitation. And so if you find it hard to believe that the sound of speech warrants academic study, I'm going to try to convince you with a simple illustration that in fact, the sound of speech is important. So I'm going to, in the next slide, play for you a brief clip of former President Obama. And as you listen, pay attention to the effect of the clip on sort of your impression of the speaker. In particular, I like to imagine the difference between, say, Obama giving this speech and, say, me giving the speech. And the idea being that, of course, I would give it in a considerably less convincing, considerably less moving way than President Obama, despite the fact that I actually often do talk in public, right? I teach, but if you were to ask my students, right, they'll of course all very quickly tell you that I'm nowhere near as convincing and compelling and interesting as former President Obama. So here's that clip. Play.
You know what? That's not who we are. That's not what this country's about. As Americans, we believe we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Right, and so if I were to read that text transcript to you, if I were to keep the content of the speech consistent, right, I could say the exact same words, people would in general respond differently to me than to President Obama. Now, I think the funny thing is, this is all sort of obvious to us, right? Like, you know this. You know that I'm not as good a speaker as President Obama. You know that, you know, being a talented speaker can help persuade, it can help mobilize an audience. We all kind of understand this about politicians and about politics and campaigning. Despite that, we don't think at all about kind of studying this component of speech and studying this component of campaigning and persuasion. And so why isn't that reflected in our study of politics? And so we think, again, that sort of the way that a candidate speaks is part of a broader rhetorical style that shapes voter perceptions. Now, we're not claiming that the content of speech doesn't matter. Of course it does, right? We're claiming that in addition to the content, these other components are also tools that a speaker can use to support and kind of further their strategic interests. So how exactly do these non-textual components of speech then influence how candidates are assessed? So to give you a brief roadmap, I'm first going to begin by a brief discussion of how we might study text and audio speeches. So this is going to build on that recent paper I just mentioned at the APSR. We're going to demonstrate face validity of some of these claims. We built a novel corpus of videos from throughout, or collected from an entire campaign cycle of Obama versus Romney when campaigning for the presidency. And so we're going to use those videos of those two candidates throughout a campaign cycle. And we're going to calculate, we're going to first create the transcripts, the textual transcripts. We're going to calculate audio features of them. And we're going to use this corpus to then build a naturalistic experiment. So we're going to find treatments embedded inside these videos. We're going to then employ those treatments in an experiment. And basically, to kind of foreshadow what we're going to do in that experiment, we're going to find, we first made the observation that throughout the course of a campaign, candidates would often say sort of similar things. They would have a particular phrase that they'd practice, something like, you know, a statement about some energy policy that maybe they had sort of memorized some statistics about employment and so on. We're going to find those pieces of speech where the text was mostly the same. And then we're going to find when they said that same piece of text differently. And so we're going to find naturalistic variation in how similar text was delivered. And then we're going to create a new tool. To find those, we create a new tool for text similarity called FFgrep. And then we're going to conduct a second experiment to probe mechanisms. So this is going to let us assess the effectiveness of different vocal styles. And to do that, we work with actors to create clips where we've held text exactly the same, but we have the actors vary certain components of the delivery. And then we also vary some other features by audio editing on our side. So those are kind of the two broad experiments that we conduct in this. And that second sort of experiment is basically a conjoint where we manipulated the speech with both voice actors and computational manipulations. So broadly, when we think about these ideas of kind of rhetorical style, campaigning effectively, effective rhetoric, effective rhetoric probably has in it a few different components, right? So a candidate for office is attempting to establish credibility in the eyes of the listener, right? They're trying to be perceived as, you know, wise, strong, inspirational, competent. They're trying to appeal to the listener's emotions, right? So maybe they're trying to mobilize around a certain issue by convincing them that this is such an important issue and developing some sort of impassioned response on the listener, maybe to induce feelings like anger and fear and hope. I think that somebody is there not muted? And then, of course, in conjunction with this, the speaker is going to try to use logical reasoning to advance their argument. And so that, again, is going to be in the text of speech. So we're not claiming, of course, that the text doesn't matter, but that the text used in conjunction with these sorts of appeals, maybe appealing to the listener's emotions, trying to seem competent and well prepared and so on, that's going to create a fuller picture of how candidates are assessed. Of course, recently in American politics, it seemed like these sorts of logical reasoning elements of campaigns have mattered less and less. So hopefully, in fact, we can return to a slightly more logical state of campaigns in American politics. These are old ideas, right? Even Aristotle wrote about the importance of persuasion and of the spoken word, where the speaker, in an attempt to persuade the listener, is trying to appeal or to convey a certain character on their part, trying to put the listener in a certain frame of mind, and trying to, again, appeal on the words of speech itself, right? So, you know, many millennia ago, people have recognized that this is important for effective rhetoric and effective campaigning. But again, this has long eluded what we can study in kind of at least the domain of quantitative social science. So we're going to, in our experiments, we're going to measure how these things affect a series of outcomes. And we're going to take these outcomes from a regularly administered survey in American politics, which you may be familiar about, the ANES. And in that, for different candidates who are running for the presidency, the respondent is asked if that candidate makes the respondent feel angry, afraid, hopeful, proud, etc. So measures of candidate affect, and then also traits like, are they inspiring, knowledgeable, moral, etc. This, I should note, again, highlights that we've long thought that these sorts of components matter. We've been asking about them for decades now on surveys that are very costly and often used in political science. But we've not quite studied the mechanisms by which we might observe variation on these sorts of outcomes that we've been asking for a very long time. So where is this in the audio? So I'm going to say a bit now about effectively feature engineering. So what do we do how do we calculate features from the actual audio itself? Again, if you are curious about this, I don't know if the paper, there's a paper for this talk, it's on my website if you're curious. But we go into even greater lengths about this in that APSR I mentioned as well. So if you're interested in the feature engineering side in particular, you might take a look at those papers. And if you are interested in the accompanying R software where we do some of this feature engineering, shoot me an email after the talk and we have an older version that's where all the feature engineering is done in R, but we should have a new version that we can share by the end of the summer that's much faster and more extensive. So where do we find this in the actual audio speech itself? Now imagine that we tried to analyze that clip of speech I played for you at the beginning of this talk of President Obama. And imagine that we did so with, your kind of canonical tools for text analysis, where, as you're probably familiar, we'd take that text, that clip of speech, we create a term document matrix, and we'd reduce that to the frequency of different terms in that piece of speech. So we'd say, okay, the word about occurred once, are occurred twice, the word we occurred 3 times, country and rights occurred once, and so on. And this would be how we would summarize that piece of speech spoken by President Obama. Now, importantly, note that if you also simultaneously analyzed me giving that same speech with the verbatim transcript, it would also appear similarly, right? There's nothing that would distinguish the difference between my ability to read that speech and deliver it effectively from Obama's. So where would that lie? Like, what is different about the way that President Obama would have said that and me? And so that difference is in the actual audio itself. And so here I'm overlaying, in this case, the loudness. So where the speaker was emphasizing certain volumes or certain words with higher and lower volumes across that piece of speech. You know what? That's not who we are. That's not what this country is about, right? So we can calculate that volume over that piece of speech, over that transcript, and that again can be overlaid with the actual text itself. We can calculate other features as well. So this is the pitch over that same series of terms. Now you'll note here that the pitch is in some cases effectively not observed. The reason for that is that pitch, unlike volume, pitch is effectively an estimate. And so not even every single spoken, say, letter has pitches, right? So pitches come from your throat. So some letters, like in English, say an S, which is sounded in the front of your mouth, like if you think about S, that doesn't have a pitch. If you imagine trying to sing a song with just the sound of S or sing a melody, right? You can't do it. If you instead tried to sing a melody with a vowel, like the A sound, you could sing that melody with that same vowel. And so we can calculate the pitch though over that same transcript. Again, in this case, zeroing out places where it can't be confidently estimated. And again, that is occurring in conjunction with these spoken terms. And so just with these two features, we can calculate both loudness and pitch across that text transcript. And so now I've put the text along the bottom, denoting them with in this case, pitch with the X and the Y axis, and color with the denoting the volume. And so I can show you what that looks like here. You know what? That's not who we are. That's not what this country is about. As Americans, we believe we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, again, you'll note I'm considerably less convincing than President Obama, but we can map that again onto this this time series of spoken text and calculate just those two features. Now, there are many, many other features we could calculate. We can calculate things like, for instance, there's a feature called zero crossing rate, which is a good one for determining vowels versus consonants, right? So there's a whole field of signal processing devoted to calculating a host of different features, which you can do with the software. In this case, we're going to focus on pitch and loudness, pitch and volume, effectively volume, mostly because they're sort of intuitive features and also features that effectively encode a lot of emotional information on the part of kind of decoding that speech. So we're going to start with, in terms of actually analyzing some speech, looking at just vocal style across campaigns. So we've got some sort of anecdotal information about how the way that candidates talk reinforces opinions and attitudes about that candidate on the part of listeners. For instance, commentators described Hillary Clinton's voice as too high-pitched to be likable, nicknamed her Shrillery. But again, we want to do better than that. So we create this original corpus of videos from the 2012 presidential election. And we focused, again, as I was mentioning, on two features, loudness and pitch. And then we're going to also focus on both their mean and their variance. And then we pair that with text that we extract from the Google Speech API. So on average, each of these transcripts, each of these videos has about 20 minutes and 3,000 words. And then to start, we're going to use a dictionary to classify the issue that the speaker was talking about in that speech. So we are going to look at the issues that was being talked about, say, at the sentence level, effectively. Now, what does that look like in practice? So this is our sort of raw data. We have a speaker, we have a date, we have a location, and we have a long text transcript. Now, we're going to start with a high-level analysis of the two candidates in the election and their speech style. So in these two panels, we're plotting the loudness mean and the loudness variation. On the left, mean, on the right, the variation. And you'll note that in general, Obama is speaking more softly, but is modulating his speech more. We do the same for pitch, so mean and modulation. And again, we similarly find that Obama sort of speaks in a more modulated way. So in turn, Romney is more monotone. That sort of makes sense because we think in general, there's a popular kind of impression that Romney is sort of a less dynamic, less compelling speaker to listen to. But more interestingly, we can look at this with respect to certain issues. So we can focus, for instance, on variation within Obama's speech style across different issues. In this case, again, learned or estimated from that dictionary that I mentioned. So after a multiple testing correction, the estimates in red are still significant. And so what are those estimates? So what we're finding is that in general, say when discussing defense and social welfare, there's relatively little variation in those features, but in contrast with, say, education and religion, we get more interesting and higher variation relative to other topics, right? So when Obama, in this case, is talking about education, he's modulating his speech more, same with religion, right? Unsurprisingly, again, when talking about something more mundane, like maybe transportation, that's less often the case. And so on education, again, as I mentioned, we observe Obama speaking at, on average, higher volumes, modulating more. Here's
we shouldn't be ending college tax credits to pay for millionaires' tax cuts. We should be making college more affordable for everyone.
Whereas on religion, he's going to speak with a lower pitch, but modulate more. So I can play an example of that as well.
And you and I together will remind the world why the United States of America is the greatest nation on earth. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
So why would he do this? Why vary speech in this way? So we suggest that voters vary speech in these non-textual ways to generate support from voters. So how are we going to test this? So in our first experiment, I'm going to describe for you two experiments that we conducted to test this. So let's think first about the ideal experiment. If we could do anything we wanted, what would we do? So ideally, we'd call up President Biden and we'd say, okay, we want you to vary your speech in these ways. Give this speech here and this speech here, and we'll see how people respond differently in those places. Now, he's not answering our phone calls, so we had to do something else. And so we instead try to do the next best thing, which is, again, as I mentioned, to find catchphrases, these commonly repeated pieces of text, and then find instances where those catchphrases, those commonly repeated pieces of text, were spoken in different ways. So what's that look like? So for instance, this first piece in red that I've highlighted could be a catchphrase. Good evening, everybody, good evening. So we'd look for that. If we think about that as being a needle that we're looking in a haystack, you'd look for that needle in every other transcript and try to find an approximate match. And then we do that for every single possible catchphrase. So we'd increment forward once and again and again. Now you're probably immediately realizing that this grows exponentially, right? We have for every possible, we have to look for every possible catchphrase in every other possible substring of that length in all the other speeches. So this, if we were to use traditional sort of string matching approaches, this would take many, many months to run. So to do that, we defined a new measure of textual similarity. And so I'll describe it as follows. So imagine that we have P and Q, both of which are K by L word letter matrices. P is going to be the needle. So in this previous case, P is red, the red string. And then we're looking in the haystack, and Q is going to be one substring of the haystack, so a possible match, effectively, where L is the number of letters. And again, K is going to be the length of the sequence, so like a 6-word sequence. Or sorry, yeah. So imagine this needle. We've doubled the amount of renewable energy that we can generate. So this would look like, this reduction would look like this. Each word would be represented by the frequency of letters in that word. And so that matrix would summarize that, that string. Now, what we can then do is define a measure of similarity that's going to be effectively a multi-dimensional measure of correlation. And then conveniently, and this is sort of the thing that makes the magic happen, we can compute this measure of similarity with a Fourier transform, which is going to get us basically, so in the one-dimensional case, this is just going to be correlation. So in the multi-dimensional case, it's still going to be bounded from -1 to 1. And it can be calculated incredibly quickly. So to demonstrate it, here's the text of specific haystack. So this is going to be a quote from a rally in Madison, Wisconsin, by President Obama. And on the right, this is that haystack's representation in this word letter form. Now, I've added to the left the needle in red. And so we would, using that measure of similarity that I mentioned 2 slides ago, first compare that red needle to that blue haystack. We'd increment forward once more and compare it again. And on the right, I'm adding that, a fictitious, in this case, measure of similarity that's calculated at that particular step forward through the haystack. We'd increment again until we do this for the entire sequence of possible matches. And now, the nature of this approach is that we're going to get measures of similarity, and in order to decide what's a match or what's not, we have to basically pick a threshold. So we're going to pick a threshold for similarity, which is going to constitute a match. And say in this case, maybe we let this kind of big spike here constitute a match. The consequence then is, again, we can compare that and we'd find a match like in this case. So this needle, we've doubled the amount of renewable energy we can generate, and we find one, we've doubled our use of renewable energy like wind and solar. We do this by cutting the corpus into 300,000 needles. We search for every needle. This gets us 90 billion string distance computations, and then produces a similarity graph of those sort of related catchphrases, which we threshold at an arbitrary value. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here's one such community. This is basically a community of similar catchphrases. So I can zoom in. We've got, something about investing in wind and solar, more about wind and solar, invest in wind and solar, progress. We need to keep investing in wind and solar, and so on. So we found a bunch of similar catchphrases. And then at this point, we'd conduct the experiment as follows. So we then manually go through and decide which of these possible catchphrases first is going to give us a pretty good match on text with some additional kind of manual coding, but then also which has varying delivery. And then we conduct an experiment where respondents see either the text, the audio, or the video of that catchphrase. So they read it, they hear it, or they watch it. So for instance, they might have to compare, they'll see this paired, they'll see two instances of this catchphrase. So if they're assigned to the text condition, they're basically comparing precisely similar text. And then they select which of the examples, which the A or the B instance of that catchphrase is higher on 8 dimensions. And these are the ones I mentioned before: make you feel angry, etc., competent. All the respondents in this case are verified voters in the 2012 election. And so now I'll note, again, these are approximate matches. So these comparisons between these two text strings are not comparing exactly equal text either. So the results are as follows. So I'm showing you now the label for each panel is a label we made kind of summarizing that catchphrase pair. The black dots are the proportion of people saying that the first instance of that catchphrase is higher on that dimension than the second. So some of these have subtle differences in text despite the approximate matching, where, say, for instance, this offshore category, right? There were large differences in how that pair was assessed on those dimensions, even though the text is similar, whereas the work category, they're virtually the same. Medicare, similar, but again, as I mentioned, offshore. Now, the difference for that, the reason is that, so for instance, in the offshore case, there was a subtle difference, which I'll mention later, where they, in one case, referred to other countries, in another case mentioned China. And so we got pretty large differences, despite those strings being basically the same except for one word. The key takeaway here, though, so the red dots are now that same choice, but if the subject listens to the audio, the blue dots is if they also hear the video. And the key takeaway from this experiment is the simple conclusion that when subjects are reading the text versus hearing and listening, they're making different decisions about which is higher on these 8 different dimensions that they rated these pairs. So for instance,
let's put Americans back to work doing the work that needs to be done.
that's one instance of that pair, and here's the second.
Let's put Americans back to work doing the work that needs to be done.
So those are really subtle differences, right? And despite those very subtle differences, we still observe differences in selections across that mode, if they're listening versus reading. So here's that work case. So this is when they are listening to versus reading that previous piece of, or that previous pair. So in that previous pair, when they're shown just the text, they randomly choose between the first and the second case because the text is exactly the same. When they can hear and also hear and see, they have a strong preference for one of the recordings versus the other.
We don't believe that anybody's entitled to success in this country, but we do believe in opportunity.
And then
we don't believe that anybody's entitled to success in this country, but we do believe in something called opportunity.
And again, here we see something similar, where that first was rated very highly on making you feel proud, strong, inspired, hopeful. The second much lower. So what makes voters form these impressions? Where are these coming from? So that last experiment that I showed you is, I think, a convincing sort of result that the way that these naturalistic sort of variations just in the world are perceived actually have effects on sort of voter impressions. But there are lots of limitations with that study, right? Those are really subtle differences. We can't hold everything fixed. There are nonetheless the small differences in text, etc. So we do a second.
A little interruption. There's a clarification question in the chat. So in your treatment condition, is that hear or see, or like, could you clarify? Is it hear or see, or hear and see for the groups?
Sorry. Yeah, they either if they're assigned to the text condition, they just have the transcript. If they're assigned to the audio condition, they only can hear. If they're assigned to the video condition, they can hear and see, but there is no only see. So the interesting thing is, for instance, on both of these, you'll note the audio and video conditions are highly correlated, right? And in general, across all the different pairs, the audio and video conditions are highly correlated. I think the reason for that is there's not that much interesting added by the video in this case. Now that doesn't mean that in other contexts there wouldn't be something added. But yeah, to clarify, they rate they select from this pair of similar text, which instance of that similar text is higher on these 8 different categories. And when they're rating, they're comparing only the text, only the sound, or the sound and the video accompanying it.
Thank you.
So in this subsequent experiment, we want to kind of disentangle these mechanisms. Like I said, this first experiment took a ton of work, actually. We had to do all the string matching and whatever, and it's still imperfect. And so we did a second experiment where we relied on voice editing and actors. And so this is going to be a cleaner test, but arguably, well, not arguably, most certainly a less naturalistic one. And so here we're going to effectively set up a conjoint. So we're going to do a factorial manipulation of speech. So we're going to have 4 artificial manipulations. And so by artificial, we mean we're going to do them. So we're going to manipulate the pitch and the volume of a piece of speech. So high or low versus loud or soft. So for instance, here's one piece of text that we're going to use to build these treatments. We took these pieces of text from the corpus that I described earlier of the Obama and Romney campaigns. So these are actual kind of pieces of text taken from real campaigns, but we're going to manipulate the way that it's delivered and add manipulations into that, keeping the text exactly fixed. And we are working with voice actors. So here's an example.
No act of terror will dim the light of the values that we proudly shine on the rest of the world. No act of terror will dim the light of the values that we proudly shine on the rest of the world.
So that second instance was louder than the first, and we did that ourselves, just with audio editing.
No act of terror will dim the light of the values that we proudly shine on the rest of the world.
That one had higher pitch, which we also did with voice editing software. So we did these ourselves in order to sort of have the cleanest possible manipulations. And then we hired 10 voice actors, or these are recordings taken from 10 voice actors, half of which are men, half of which are women.
No act of terror. No act of terror. No act of terror. No act of terror.
No act of terror. No act of terror.
No act of terror.
No act of terror. No act of terror will dim the light of the values that we proudly shine on the rest of the world.
So we use 10 different voice actors because we don't want to find a result that's sort of a local effect of a particular interaction with one speaker. And so we, in this case, then asked each actor to record each piece of each text transcript 4 different times. So we have a fully cross manipulation as follows. So the actor themselves, manipulated the rate of speech, and then also if they were modulating versus speaking in a monotone way. And so we had them do those manipulations because those are much harder to naturalistically vary computationally. And then these get fully crossed with the high-low pitch and the loud-soft volume treatments that we do mechanically. So.
And no act of violence will shake the resolve of the United States of America. And no act of violence will shake the resolve of the United States of America.
So that's the naturalistic variation in rate of speech. Similarly.
And no act of violence will shake the resolve of the United States of America.
That's the more monotone delivery. So again, these are still relatively subtle manipulations, but we're able to keep everything else on average fixed. And then we also had 6 different scripts. So each actor read 6 scripts 4 different ways, all of which each script was taken from these identified catchphrases that I mentioned. So I'm going to show you the results quickly from the second experiment. So first, I'm going to show you baseline differences between speakers. So here, these are just the average response for each of the 10 different voice actors on the same outcomes that we were using previously. So we asked, in this case, instead of showing the subject a pair, we had them rate that recording on these different dimensions. And here they're rating, say, the competence, the enthusiasm, etc. But so in this first plot, I'm showing you just the average rating per speaker. So the key takeaway here is this. across all these different 10 speakers, the text of speech was held exactly constant, right? So nothing varied from the expressed platform, the expressed position, etc., across these 10 speakers. Nonetheless, we see variation in, say, which speaker is perceived as more competent, which is perceived as more inspiring. So you'll note speaker A, for instance, across the board was perceived as less competent, less trustworthy, less persuasive, whereas speaker J was on average perceived as considerably more inspiring, trustworthy, passionate, etc. And then we also asked them willingness to vote for this person. And here we again see relatively large differences across speaker, even though the expressed platform statements, etc., are the same, where speaker A is evaluated very poorly in terms of willingness to vote, speaker J relatively positively. Now, that's setting aside completely our experimental manipulations. So I can show those to you now. And again, we see relatively large effects in the kind of change in the evaluation across these manipulations. So for instance, especially with respect to the modulation manipulation, the speakers who are modulating more, or the recordings which modulate speech more, are evaluated considerably better in terms of perceived competence, enthusiasm, etc., trustworthiness. And also with respect to voting, right? So this is, again, that willingness to vote for that candidate. Speaking at a slower rate of speech is punished, or conversely, speaking at a faster rate there is a benefit, at least on the levels that we manipulate in this experiment. That's similar as well in these evaluation over issues. And interestingly, so we don't want to make too much about gender differences, not because we don't believe that there are gender differences, but because given that we only have 5 speakers per gender, it's difficult to disentangle whether the results with respect to, it is difficult to say with much confidence to what extent the differences in gender are an artifact of 1 or 2 unique speakers versus a reflection of the general population estimate. We've thought about doing a follow-up experiment where we really try to probe that, but I think in order to do it, we'd need many, many speakers. But I think these are probably sort of, I think there's something here, and so I'll show those results as well. And so what we find in general is that, so these are those same results broken out by gender. Now, interestingly, at first glance, it may look like women are benefiting more from, say, these things, these traits associated with better speech, like more modulation, etc. What's actually happening is that on average, the evaluation is lower for women. And when women speak in ways that are perceived as sort of more dynamic, that penalty from the baseline is offset to some degree. But it's from a shift down in the effectively control condition rather than a shift to a higher mean in the treatment condition. And that's also evident in the expressed willingness to vote, where we see, again, this larger difference in the modulation result for women rather than men. So I will summarize these results. So as I mentioned, this is sort of one of the first descriptive analyses of these elements of campaign speech style beyond simply the words of speech. We have shown experimental evidence that real-world differences have effects on real-world voters, that the voice in turn conveys information that's not strictly present or cannot be strictly reduced to the text. And we find experimental evidence on speech mechanisms, that specific vocal channels, specific features of speech shape perceptions of candidates. Again, I think weirdly, this is actually a thing that we all kind of think we knew, but it was sort of not a thing that we knew how to study as well. And so we hope that this is sort of laying the groundwork for a sort of richer analysis of political communication and political speech. And so with that, that concludes my time.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the great talk. So as always, for the audience, if you have questions, please put a Q in the chat. And So while we wait for questions to come in, I would just start by asking a little bit of clarification question for the experiment part. So how did you so could you share a little bit more about how did you work with the speakers, the voice actors, like who are they, and then how you work with them to give them instructions to vary these different voice features? Yeah, so could you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, so we hired the actors through through Upwork. So that's how we got in contact with them. There was sort of a kind of large number of workers who basically did freelance voice recording stuff. So I think most of these people, a lot of their work would be, maybe they're recording a commercial, a radio ad, something like that. We gave them the 6 scripts and then described the 4 recordings that we needed. Somewhat, I think humorously, they often sort of balked at delivering this in a less like kind of dynamic seeming way. Like they didn't want to say this in a monotone way. So we said, look, we know that you're a dynamic actor. You've spent years, refining your ability to speak in public. We need you to now for a minute pretend to like forget all that and deliver this in a monotone way, right? And so we tried to kind of describe basically the 2 manipulations they had to do, which was the modulation and the rate of speech. And they then, recorded this. They almost all had relatively high, they all did have relatively high quality recording setups by virtue of doing this sort of work often. They sent us the recordings online, and then we did the remaining 2 manipulations on our side.
Okay, thank you so much.
I have a question. So thank you for the great talk. So I was just, your talk really like got me thinking like this way and that way, really like explore, really like interest feature. One of them was like, can we do some kind of like cluster analysis based on like speech styles? Like, I think if I think about like politicians, so some have some kind of like common features in it. People perceive, from what they speak, this guy is really cocky, right? This guy is really kind of generous and really like helpful things. But like you said in the talk, so I think that's not only determined by the content of it, but the same content might be perceived differently based on the speech style. So I was just wondering, like, this is open question. Have you kind of explored the way that we can just cluster the types of speech and how that turns out to be manipulation outcome or anything like that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we're working on another paper right now where we scraped all the data from the New Zealand Parliament and are trying to do a series of analyses at the kind of Parliament level. And so there we have present hundreds of speakers over the course of that data. And it is also the case that the New Zealand Parliament is very animated on occasion. So you get both like a range of different ways of speaking and also within speaker, a lot of variation on issues. I think there we could certainly do, we haven't done this yet. I'm going to make a note of it, but we haven't done a sort of clustering there. We certainly could, one thing that, is, so for instance, you can reduce with like kind of try to learn an embedding per, like an audio embedding effectively of each speaker, which maybe would map to one of their styles. But yeah, there are all sorts of ways we could try to cluster or map speakers to some common space or spaces like that. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, but at the same time, so a whole lot of complexity comes in, right? Because of the because we are just adding up to like the text feature, then goes up to the audio features. So it's a whole lot of complexity, but it's not quite like strict like cluster analysis, but maybe just making typologies of like speech styles and strategies, and also depending on the situation. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we did an analysis. So in that APSR article that I mentioned, we wrote that on the Supreme Court, or that was the data that we used. And there it was so interesting. It was really interesting because we wrote that paper we started it when we were in grad school. So we did most of the hand coding ourselves, which meant that I spent a lot of time listening to a lot of justices say a lot of things. And it is interesting because you get this, like certain justices are relatively very animated and others are just deadpan, and, again, I'm sure in any case where you start labeling a lot of data like that, you'd observe similar variation across speakers. And then if you ex ante knew you were interested in, say, the connection between that and certain labels or like certain textual labels, that would be interesting too.
Yeah, so maybe just another follow-up thing was that I think one of the kind of standout features in audio in your analysis is that kind of modularity, right? Maybe that might be particular for President Obama, but I think so maybe people or all politicians are different in terms of that. So have you found some evidence from like kind of real like audio linguistic analysis that modularity really matters for persuasion and things like that? So was there any kind of like literature that you kind of cited and just delved into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is so the literature, it's a funny thing, like you get qualitative accounts of something, say someone being told I'm too monotone, and then campaign vocal coaches basically saying you need to sound more dynamic. I still remember in graduate school, after one of the first talks I gave, my advisor literally told me, you're way too monotone when you talk, in a slightly kinder way, but that was effectively the takeaway. And you see that reflected in, we've read autobiographies of people being told this, we've heard accounts of people being told this. You see this in all sorts of things. But I think where there's a gap is, you then have all the people doing computational stuff, and they are over here kind of trying to do signal processing for effectively feature engineering to learn some model, where there the particular kind of mechanisms are sort of black box in a bit. So there are some papers related to this that we engage with in the paper, but I think partly this is also sort of one of the things we're doing in the paper. There isn't actually too much evidence like this on these sorts of topics in the context of politics, I should say.
Thank you, Chris. So I see one question from Haixin Mu, and then next is Li Liao. So Haixin, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot for sharing this great project with us. It's just a question out of my curiosity because I'm not major in political science, but I'm wondering why you decide to use the 2012 election to construct your corpus, because it's 10 years ago and I know it's a recent project you work with. So it's just of my curiosity. Thank you.
You're going to make me feel old. So we first were doing something with this data in the APSR article, which we started in 2015. And then we had this data sitting there, and then we wrote, I mean, the consequences that we collected the data before, we collected the data about 7 years ago. So that's the actual reason. The other reason is that in that campaign, we found both lists of the campaigns that or where they gave speeches, and also were able to find those speeches on YouTube. And so they were also available. We could extend it. I mean, I think there's something about, we could extend it. It's actually a bit of work too, though. But, so that's the combination. We did the work and it was the data that we had.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Haixin. And then Liao Li.
Thank you, Professor. This is very cool project. So I have a question. I'm not sure it's a question, but it's about application. So I mainly study comparative politics. And so when I hear about your project, especially talking about this American, like these leaders, they change their tone strategically. And I suddenly think about the situation in China, because like leaders in China, they kind of like you don't see the change of tone here, so it's like very calm. And I would think, do you think if it's interesting to compare like leaders across the nation? I mean, like you take autocracy and democracy as a main variable to see if this if their speech style is related to their leadership style, something like that, or like a country, like the nature of the country, is it autocracy or democracy? Because I would imagine, yeah, if I as a Chinese and I think about my country's situation, I would think like much of the autocrats, they would use very plain tone to show their kind of like a mysterious style things, like it's like a veil of autocracy things. But I'm not quite sure, but I think might be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting for sure. I think I could be wrong. I forget. I think Haohan's project is somewhat related to this, but the Haohan is an interesting project that I think is addressing some of those issues. But we were, I think, yes, I think there's probably certainly something there. I think it's a really hard problem to think about, only because so much of the way that these things matters is so language specific, right? Like, so, you know, even if you think about a language with tones and without tones, like the way that, say, something like the modulation or the monotoneness of a piece of speech or volume, say, right? Like, you know, might be very different. And so that, which doesn't mean that that's not occurring in consistent ways across, say, regime type, or in consistent ways with within language or whatever. But that I think basically studying that at the scale of, you know, comparative politics then requires that we get enough variation within those different types that it's tough. But I think basically my short answer is I think there's almost certainly something there, but I think the analysis would require a lot of work. I think my sense is that Haohan's solving those things though, so we should hopefully know soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the question, one more question from Han.
Okay, great talk. I actually have two questions. So one is more on the method side, and the other is a very general question. So on the method side, I'm kind of thinking about the ways to, you know, use audio data, you know, regression models, right? So to some extent, like audio data is sort of like if you use, for instance, if you use audio kind of sequence as independent variables, so intrinsically the input, like independent variable, is sort of like a sequence, right? And of course, you could turn that into, you know, high in page, low in page, that sort of what I don't know, standardized variable or something. But I don't know if you have good suggestions to, you know, maybe treating that as a real sequence, you know, regression model instead of, you know, some split out whatever variables. Yeah. So that's a very technical methodological question I have. And a very general question is, so I'm not a political scientist. I'm trained as a sociologist. So I know, like, you know, this might be a disciplinary differences. So when I hear this, I'm keep thinking, okay, so what are the data sources of audio data, right? And like politician speeches, certainly, like we have a lot of them. But is there a possibility that we could obtain some, like, you know, like normal citizens, you know, audio whatever audio data, which I'm kind of thinking about this problem. I'm thinking that might be harder than if you were to obtain like text or image or video data, where, like, you know, on social media they might post text, post images, post videos. But I rarely see another case where a kind of source where I can actually get, like, you know, audio data beyond politicians, right? So I don't know if you have any good ideas on this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, those are great questions. They're fun questions because I think I have papers for both. So that's the best kind of question to get. So to your first question about kind of modeling your intuition is exactly right. Your first question about kind of modeling the audio as a sequence. So that's basically how we set up in this other paper, and I put it into chat.
Oh, great. Yeah.
That's how we set up the analysis. So basically what we did was we modeled so that imagine a single piece of speech, right? It's the audio itself is just that wave. So the vector of the wave frequencies across that the full length of the speech. We create or calculate audio features of very small pieces of time across that vector. So like 12.5 milliseconds or something, which turns that vector into a dense matrix of features by time. And then the model that we use in that case is a hidden Markov model. And so we set that up as a hidden Markov model where basically there are labels you're trying to learn about a given, like the latent state that generated that piece of speech. So maybe it's something like the speaker was angry. But then when we set it up as a Markov model, what we can do is put structure on it as well and basically estimate covariates. So we put over top of that a regression. And so we can get covariates like the effect of the previous speaker's gender on the transition probabilities. So which in plainer English is like, are you more likely, say that the labels are anger? Are you more likely to get angry when the previous speaker was a woman in speech in parliament? Say, is the kind of thing you can do. So that's we had exactly that kind of intuition in that model. The models, yeah, it was a bit of a brute of a paper. So, but we do have code for it, and hopefully we'll have more usable code in the next month or two if that's interesting to you.
Yeah, great. I'll take a look. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, and your second question, we're actually working on this now. So we have a follow-up, another study that we're doing where we're bringing a lot of different undergraduates into labs and having them have discussions with each other about certain hot button issues and recording them as they do it. So recording the words they say, but also their face and the audio, and are basically going to look at how they're basically going to be trying to convince each other of certain things. And we're going to set it up as kind of a deliberation experiment where we have, say, two groups of two, say, arguing about a hot button issue. And, we'll be able to see which ones are, if there are any patterns about what's more convincing, what makes a side more convincing than others, and so on. So I think, yeah, those are exactly kind of the directions that we want to push some of these projects.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So let's have one final question that's in the chat from Baiqi. I think that's pretty much a clarification question about your R package. Can you take a transcribe R?
Yes, that's not the package I was talking about. That is an old package for speech transcription. I think HP broke that package. So if you want to fix that package, you can, maybe you can shoot me an email. But there's I use other stuff for transcription these days. I mostly use something called Vosk, which is actually really good and open source and free. So you might try that. If you are trying to do this, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to talk about different packages and options.
Okay. So it's time. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and asking questions. And so we'll be back in 15 minutes for the next session. And so Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's a great pleasure to hear about your very exciting research, and all the best for its next step.
Thanks for having me. This was a pleasure.
Great. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.